The bright afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Martinez's boutique, casting warm shadows across the polished wooden floors. Sarah Martinez moved quietly between the racks of designer clothes, her fingers gently touching the expensive fabrics as she worked. At 16, she had the same elegant features as her father: high cheekbones, bright brown eyes, and a warm smile that made everyone feel welcome. The boutique was quiet at this hour, with only a few regular customers browsing the new collection. Sarah liked these peaceful moments when she could help her father by checking inventory. She pulled out her tablet and started scanning items, making notes about which pieces needed to be restocked. This was her favorite after-school task, especially on Wednesdays when her father had his weekly business meetings downtown. James Martinez had built this store from nothing 20 years ago. People told him he was crazy to open an upscale boutique in this part of town, but he proved them wrong. Now, Martinez Boutique was one of the most successful high-end clothing stores in the city. Sarah felt proud every time she thought about her father's achievement, especially since he had done it all as a single parent after her mother passed away. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah called out with a bright smile as one of their regular customers entered the store. The elderly woman waved back warmly. She had been shopping here since Sarah was a little girl who used to hide between the clothing racks while her father worked. Sarah continued her inventory work, placing several expensive items in her special canvas bag, the one her father had given her specifically for this purpose. It had the store's logo elegantly embroidered on the side. She needed to check these pieces carefully because some customers had reported issues with the stitching. Outside the store, Officer Kevin Bradley sat in his patrol car watching. He had been on the force for 15 years and prided himself on what he called his cop instincts. When he saw Sarah putting expensive clothes in her bag, those instincts kicked in immediately. He didn't notice her tablet, her careful checking of each item, or the way other employees smiled and nodded at her as she worked. He saw what he expected to see: something suspicious. Back inside, Sarah was almost finished with her task. She had found 3 items with loose stitching that needed to be returned to the manufacturer. Her father would be proud of her attention to detail. She loved helping him run the store and secretly hoped to take over the business someday after finishing college. The store's atmosphere remained peaceful. Classical music played softly through hidden speakers, another of her father's touches that made the boutique feel special. 2 more customers had come in, and Lisa, one of their sales associates, was helping them find the perfect evening wear for an upcoming charity event. Sarah checked her phone and saw a message from her father. "Meeting running late. Everything okay at the store?" She quickly typed back, "All good, Dad. Found some items that need to be returned. With a full report ready when you're back." She smiled at his reply, a simple heart emoji. That was so like her father, a successful businessman who could negotiate million-dollar contracts but still sent his daughter heart emojis. James Martinez might own one of the city's most exclusive boutiques, but he never let success change who he was or how he treated people. As Sarah moved to the front of the store to help Lisa with the customers, she didn't notice Officer Bradley getting out of his patrol car. She didn't see him straightening his uniform or the way his hand rested near his weapon. She was too busy thinking about the inventory report she would give her father and the calculus homework she needed to finish later. The sun continued to shine through the boutique's windows, creating beautiful patterns on the floor. The classical music played softly in the background. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, perfect. But in just a few minutes, this quiet afternoon would turn into something very different. Sarah Martinez, daughter of one of the city's most successful business owners, was about to learn how quickly assumptions and prejudice could shatter that peace. Officer Kevin Bradley pushed open the boutique's heavy glass door, setting off the gentle chime that announced customers. But he wasn't here to shop. His eyes locked onto Sarah, who was still holding her canvas bag filled with clothing. The classical music that had seemed so peaceful just moments ago now felt tense and uncomfortable. "You there? Don't move." Bradley's voice cut through the quiet store like a knife. Several customers jumped, startled by the sudden harsh tone. Sarah turned around, confused. She had been so focused on her inventory work that she hadn't noticed the police officer's entrance. "Put the bag down slowly and keep your hands where I can see them," Bradley ordered, his right hand resting on his weapon. His face showed no doubt, no hesitation, just the certainty of someone who believed they had caught a criminal in the act. Sarah's heart began to race, but she stayed calm like her father had always taught her. "Officer, there's been a mistake," she said clearly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I work here. This is my father's store." Bradley let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Sure it is. That's why you're stuffing expensive clothes into a bag, right?" He moved closer, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The other customers backed away, creating a small circle around Sarah and the officer. Lisa, the sales associate, stepped forward quickly. "Officer, she's telling the truth. This is Sarah Martinez. Her father owns." "Ma'am." "Step back." Bradley cut her off sharply. "This is police business." He turned his attention back to Sarah. "Put the bag down now, or things are going to get much worse for you." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she placed her canvas bag on the counter. She could see Mrs. Thompson, the regular customer, already on her phone, probably trying to call her father. But Sarah knew he was still in his meeting downtown. "Officer Bradley," Sarah read his name tag, speaking as calmly as she could. "Please check the bag. It has our store logo on it. I'm doing inventory for my father, Mr. Martinez. You can call him." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Bradley interrupted. He pulled out his handcuffs, the metal catching the afternoon sunlight. "You have the right to remain silent." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. She couldn't. "Please, just look at my ID. Check the security cameras. Ask any of the staff." Bradley grabbed her arm, spinning her around roughly. The handcuffs felt cold and heavy as he snapped them around her wrists. Sarah could hear gasps from the customers. Lisa was frantically dialing on her phone, probably trying to reach their security company or perhaps her father. "I've been watching you put clothes in that bag for the last 20 minutes, Bradley said, his voice hard and certain. "Do you know how many kids like you I catch trying to steal from stores like this? Did you think nobody would notice?" The words, "kids like you," hung in the air, their meaning clear to everyone in the store. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "Officer, I've known this young lady since she was a child. Her father." "Ma'am, interfering with a police officer will get you arrested too," Bradley warned, cutting off another potential witness. He seemed determined not to listen to anyone who might prove him wrong. Sarah stood there, handcuffed in the middle of her father's store, surrounded by people who knew her but couldn't help. The inventory tablet she had been using lay forgotten on a nearby counter, its screen still showing the list of items she had been checking. Through the windows, curious pedestrians had started to gather, watching the scene unfold. Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation. She thought about her father, about how hard he had worked to build this business, about all the times he had warned her that some people would see her differently because of her skin color. "Officer, please," Sarah tried one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just wait for my father. He'll be here soon. He can prove." "Save it for the station," Bradley said firmly, reaching for the canvas bag to check its contents. He was so sure of himself, so convinced he was right, that he didn't notice the expensive business cards in the bag's front pocket. Cards that clearly read, "James Martinez, owner, Martinez Boutique." The next few minutes in Martinez Boutique felt like hours. Sarah stood handcuffed near the counter while Officer Bradley searched through the canvas bag, pulling out each piece of clothing roughly. The elegant items that Sarah had carefully checked for quality control now lay scattered across the glass display case. "Officer Bradley," Lisa tried again, her voice stronger this time. She held up her phone, showing the store's website. "Look at this. This is Mr. Martinez and Sarah. She's his daughter. We can prove it." Bradley barely glanced at the phone. "Anyone can create a fake website," he said dismissively. "This is a common trick. They make themselves look legitimate to gain access to high-end stores." He pulled out his radio to call for backup, convinced he had uncovered some sophisticated shoplifting scheme. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Some people were filming with their phones, their faces pressed against the boutique's windows. Sarah felt sick to her stomach, knowing these videos would probably end up on social media. She could already imagine the headlines. "Teen caught stealing from luxury store. Nobody would wait to hear the truth." Mrs. Thompson, still trying to reach James Martinez, moved closer to Sarah. "Sweetheart, your father's phone is going straight to voicemail, but I've left messages. They'll be here soon." She turned to Bradley, her voice sharp with anger. "And when he arrives, officer, you'll have a lot of explaining to do." Bradley ignored her, focusing instead on questioning Sarah. "How did you get the store's logo on this bag? Who are you working with?" His tone suggested he had already decided she was guilty, no matter what anyone said. "That bag was a birthday gift from my father," Sarah answered quietly, remembering the day her dad had given it to her. He had been so proud to have his daughter helping with the family business. "Please, just check the security cameras. They'll show you I work here." Just then, Marcus, the store's security guard, rushed in. He had been on his lunch break when everything started. "Officer, there's been a huge mistake," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm the head of security here. Sarah Martinez is the owner's daughter." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Bradley's face, but instead of acknowledging it, he seemed to become more aggressive. "If you're security, where were you? Why weren't you watching her?" "Because she doesn't need watching," Marcus explained, frustrated. "She practically grew up in this store. She helps manage it." The classical music still playing in the background now felt surreal, its gentle melody a strange contrast to the tense scene unfolding. Sarah could feel the handcuffs digging into her wrists, but she stood straight and tall, just like her father had taught her. She thought about all the times he had sat her down to talk about situations like this, about how some people would judge her before knowing her. "Your backup isn't coming, Officer Bradley," Lisa announced, checking her phone. "I just spoke to your precinct. They're sending your supervisor instead." I explained the situation. Bradley's face reddened. He looked around the store, finally seeming to notice the details he had ignored before. The family photos on the wall behind the counter, the professional way the store was organized, the respect the staff clearly had for Sarah. "If you just listened to us from the beginning," Mrs. Thompson said, shaking her head, "you wouldn't be in this mess now. But you saw what you wanted to see, didn't you?" Sarah felt a tear finally escape down her cheek, not from fear anymore, but from anger and frustration. She thought about her father, about how hard he had worked to give her a good life, to teach her to be strong, to handle situations like this with dignity, but nothing had prepared her for how it would actually feel. Suddenly, a deep, familiar voice cut through the tension. "Take those handcuffs off my daughter. Now." Everyone turned toward the door. James Martinez stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, his face a mixture of fury and pain. The crowd outside parted as he strode into his store, his presence commanding respect. Officer Bradley's face drained of color as he finally realized the magnitude of his mistake. James Martinez's footsteps echoed through the now silent store as he walked toward his handcuffed daughter. His face remained calm, but anyone who knew him could see the storm brewing in his eyes. The crowd outside pressed closer to the windows, phones still recording, sensing that something important was about to happen. "I said," James repeated slowly, his voice quiet but firm, "take those handcuffs off my daughter." He pulled out his wallet and placed his driver's license, business card, and store ownership documents on the counter. "Here's my identification, Officer Bradley. Though I shouldn't need to prove who I am in my own store." Bradley stood frozen for a moment, looking from the documents to James, then to Sarah. The truth he had refused to see earlier now stared him in the face. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached for his keys and moved to unlock Sarah's handcuffs. As soon as she was free, Sarah ran into her father's arms. James held her tight, his expensive suit getting wet with her tears. He whispered something in her ear that made her stand up straighter, wipe her eyes, and face Officer Bradley with the same dignity her father showed. "Mr. Martinez," Bradley started, his voice uncertain. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" James cut him off. "Let me tell you what I understand, Officer Bradley. I understand that you saw my daughter, a young black girl, in an expensive store and made assumptions. I understand that you ignored multiple people who tried to tell you who she was. I understand that you put handcuffs on a 16-year-old girl without proper cause." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, still angry. "You wouldn't even look at the proof we tried to show him, James. He threatened to arrest me when I tried to explain." Bradley's supervisor, Sergeant Chen, walked in at that moment. She took in the scene, the scattered clothing, the crowd outside, the security guard standing protectively near Sarah, and the store owner facing down her officer. "Officer Bradley," Sergeant Chen said sharply, "step outside and wait in your car." We'll discuss this back at the station. As Bradley turned to leave, she added, "Leave your badge and gun with me. You're on administrative leave pending an investigation." After Bradley left, Sergeant Chen turned to the Martinez family. "Mr. Martinez, I apologize for my officer's conduct. We'll need statements from everyone here, and I promise you this incident will be thoroughly investigated." James nodded, but his attention was on his daughter. "Sarah, go to my office and rest for a bit. I'll handle things down here." But Sarah shook her head. "No, Dad, I want to stay. I want to tell them exactly what happened." Her voice was steady now, her initial fear replaced by determination. James smiled slightly, recognizing his own strength in his daughter. The next hour passed in a blur of statements and photographs. The security cameras had captured everything, showing Sarah clearly doing inventory work. The canvas bag with the store's logo, the inventory tablet, and multiple witnesses all confirmed what Bradley had refused to see. As the crowd outside finally began to disperse, James stood in the middle of his store, looking at the mess Bradley had made of the expensive clothes. But his mind wasn't on the scattered merchandise. "I bought this store 20 years ago," he said quietly to Sergeant Chen. "The previous owner tried to talk me out of it. Said someone like me couldn't run a high-end boutique in this neighborhood. Now it's one of the most successful stores in the city. I worked hard to give my daughter a good life, to protect her from exactly this kind of prejudice, but here we are." Sarah touched her father's arm. "Dad, remember what you always tell me? We can't control how people see us, but we can control how we respond." James hugged his daughter again, proud of her wisdom and strength. Looking at Sergeant Chen, he said, "I want to file a formal complaint, not just for Sarah, but for every kid who looks like her, who might walk into a store one day and face the same assumptions. This has to stop." As the sun began to set outside the boutique's windows, casting long shadows across the floor, father and daughter stood together, ready to turn this painful incident into something meaningful, a chance for real change. 1 week after the incident at Martinez Boutique, the story had spread far beyond their city. News channels played the cell phone videos taken by onlookers, social media buzzed with discussions, and civil rights groups called for action. But inside the quiet office of Police Chief Roberts, James Martinez was focused on something different. "Mr. Martinez," Chief Roberts said, shuffling through papers on his desk, "Officer Bradley's record shows 7 other complaints of racial profiling in the past 3 years. All were dismissed due to lack of evidence." He looked up at James. "But this time, we have video evidence, multiple witnesses, and clear proof of misconduct." Sarah sat next to her father, her hands folded in her lap. The handcuff marks had faded from her wrists, but the memory remained fresh. She watched as her father leaned forward in his chair. "I understand you expect me to demand Officer Bradley's firing," James said calmly. "And you're probably prepared to do that, given the media attention this case has received." He paused, looking at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "But that's not what we want." Chief Roberts raised his eyebrows in surprise. Even Sarah's incident had become national news, with many people calling for Bradley to be fired immediately. The chief hadn't expected this turn in the conversation. Instead, James continued, "We want to propose something different. My daughter and I have discussed this extensively. We want Officer Bradley to understand why his actions were wrong, not just face punishment. We want real change, not just consequences." Sarah spoke up, her voice clear and confident. "We want Officer Bradley to undergo extensive training about racial bias. Not just a one-day seminar, but real, meaningful training. And we want him to work with youth groups in our community to get to know the people he's supposed to protect." The chief sat back in his chair, studying father and daughter. Outside his office window, protesters could be seen gathering, holding signs demanding justice. But here, in this quiet room, the Martinez family was offering something more valuable than punishment. They were offering a chance for genuine change. "We've already spoken with the Community Youth Center," James explained. "They're willing to have Officer Bradley volunteer there for 6 months, working with teenagers from different backgrounds. We want him to see them as people, not suspects." Sarah pulled out a folder from her bag, the same canvas bag that had started all this trouble. "We've also researched several intensive bias training programs," she said, pushing the folder across the desk. "These are the ones we think would be most effective." Chief Roberts opened the folder, impressed by the thoroughness of their proposal. Each program was carefully selected, with notes about why it would be beneficial. The Martinez family had clearly put considerable thought into this. "There's one more thing," James added. "We want to work with your department to develop better training protocols for all officers. Sarah and I are willing to share our story to help other officers understand the impact of their assumptions." The chief looked out his window again, watching the protesters. Then he looked at Sarah, seeing not a victim, but a young woman determined to create positive change. Finally, he looked at James, who had every right to be angry, but was choosing a path of education and understanding instead. "Your proposal is unexpected," Chief Roberts admitted. "Most people in your position would want punishment, not rehabilitation." Sarah smiled slightly. "My dad always says that breaking something is easy, but building something better takes work. We want to help build something better." James reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand, proud of her wisdom. "Chief Roberts, firing Officer Bradley might satisfy some people's desire for justice, but it won't solve the larger problem. We want to address the root cause, the assumptions and biases that led to this incident." The chief nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Outside, the protesters continued their chants for justice, unaware that in this quiet office, a different kind of justice was taking shape. Not the kind that ends careers, but the kind that changes hearts and minds. "Mr. Martinez, Sarah," Chief Roberts said finally, "I think you might be right. This could be the beginning of real change in our department." Officer Kevin Bradley stood nervously in front of the Community Youth Center, wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform for the first time in years. It had been 2 months since the incident at Martinez Boutique, and today was his first day of community service. The building looked welcoming enough, with its bright murals and clean windows, but Bradley felt like his feet were made of lead. Inside, a group of teenagers sat in a circle, some looking at him with open distrust. Marcus, the security guard from Martinez Boutique, stood nearby. He had agreed to help run these sessions, bridging the gap between Bradley and the kids. It was strange how life worked sometimes. The man he had dismissed that day was now here to help him learn. "Take a seat, Officer Bradley," Marcus said, pointing to an empty chair in the circle. "Today, we're going to talk about first impressions and assumptions." Some of the teenagers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They had all seen the viral video of what happened at the boutique. Bradley sat down, his face warm with shame. The bias training he'd been attending for the past 2 months had opened his eyes to many things, but this, facing actual teenagers who looked just like Sarah Martinez, felt different. It felt real. "Let's start with a simple exercise," Marcus announced. "Everyone take out your phones." He waited as the teenagers pulled out their devices. Some had the latest models, others had older versions with cracked screens. "Officer Bradley, what assumptions might some people make about these kids based on their phones?" Bradley looked around the circle, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. The boy with the expensive phone was wearing worn-out shoes. The girl with the cracked screen had a designer backpack. Nothing was as simple as it first appeared. I would have made assumptions," Bradley admitted, his voice quiet, "about how they got those phones, about their families, about—" He stopped, the weight of his prejudices becoming clear to him. One of the teenagers, a boy named Michael, spoke up. "Like how you assumed Sarah Martinez was stealing just because she was black in an expensive store." His voice wasn't angry, just direct. It cut through Bradley's defenses like a knife. "Yes," Bradley answered honestly. "Exactly like that." His hands were shaking slightly as he continued. "I've been a cop for 15 years. I told myself I was just being vigilant, doing my job. But that day at the boutique, it made me see how wrong I'd been." Over the next 2 hours, the teenagers shared their stories. They talked about being followed in stores, about having security called on them for no reason, about the constant suspicion they faced. Each story felt like a mirror to Bradley, showing him reflections of his own past actions. "You know what the hardest part is?" a girl named Tasha said. "It's not even the big stuff, like what happened to Sarah. It's the small things. The way people clutch their bags when we walk by, the way they assume we can't afford to be in certain places." Bradley thought about all the times he had done exactly those things, the subtle ways he had shown his bias without even realizing it. The training sessions he'd attended had taught him about systemic racism and unconscious bias, but these teenagers were teaching him about the human cost of those prejudices. Marcus watched as understanding slowly transformed Bradley's face. "This is just the beginning," he said. "You'll be here 3 times a week for the next 6 months. These kids have a lot to teach you, if you're willing to learn." "I am," Bradley said, and for the first time since the incident, he felt something close to hope. He looked around the circle at the young faces watching him. "I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I want to do better. I need to do better." As the session ended and the teenagers began to leave, one of them stopped by Bradley's chair. It was Michael, the boy who had mentioned Sarah earlier. "You know," he said quietly, "Sarah's dad did you a favor. He could have had you fired, but instead, he gave you a chance to change. Don't waste it." Bradley watched the boy leave, those words echoing in his mind. Outside the youth center, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he understood that this wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. 6 months had passed since Officer Bradley's first day at the youth center. Now, on a crisp morning, he stood once again in front of Martinez's boutique. This time, he wore no uniform, carried no badge, and held only a small envelope in his slightly trembling hands. The same glass doors that had witnessed his biggest mistake now waited for him to find the courage to push them open. Inside, the store looked exactly as he remembered it. Classical music played softly, sunlight streamed through the windows, and the racks of designer clothes stood in perfect order. But Bradley saw it all differently now. He noticed the family photos on the walls that he had ignored before, the warm atmosphere that spoke of years of careful building, and the pride that went into every detail. Lisa, the sales associate who had tried to stop him that day, spotted him first. Her eyes widened in recognition, but before she could say anything, Sarah Martinez walked out from behind a display. She had grown taller in the past 6 months, and there was a new confidence in her walk. When she saw Bradley, she stopped for a moment, then called out, "Dad, you might want to come out here." James Martinez emerged from his office, dressed as impeccably as ever. He looked at Bradley, his face neutral but not unkind. "Officer Bradley," he said quietly. "Or is it still officer?" "Just Mr. Bradley now," Kevin replied, his voice rough with emotion. I resigned from the force last week." He saw the surprise on their faces and quickly added, "Not because I had to, because I chose to." James gestured toward his office. "Perhaps we should talk in private," but Bradley shook his head. "No, sir, I think I need to say this here where it happened." He looked around the store, at the spot where he had handcuffed Sarah, where his prejudices had caused so much pain. "These past 6 months at the youth center, they changed me. Those kids, they taught me things no police training ever did." Sarah moved closer to her father, listening intently as Bradley continued. "Last week, Michael, one of the teenagers, got detained at a mall for suspicious behavior. He was just waiting for his little sister outside a store. When I heard about it, I realized something. Even after everything I'd learned, I was still part of a system that keeps making the same mistakes." He opened the envelope he was holding and pulled out some papers. "So I made a decision. I'm going back to school to study social work. I want to work with young people, help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community." He paused, swallowing hard. "But first, I needed to come here, to apologize properly." Bradley turned to Sarah. "What I did to you was wrong, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. I judged you based on nothing but my own prejudices, and I'm deeply sorry." He looked at James. "And to you, sir, I'm sorry for disrespecting your daughter, your business, and everything you've built." James studied Bradley's face for a long moment. "You know, when I suggested the youth center program, some people thought I was being too lenient. They said you deserved harsher punishment." He smiled slightly. "But I believe that true change comes from understanding, not from punishment alone." Sarah stepped forward. "The kids at the center told me about you," she said. "About how you really listened to them, how you changed over time. Michael said you even helped him with his college applications." Bradley nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "They helped me more than I helped them. They showed me what real strength looks like. Like you did that day, Sarah. You stayed dignified even when I treated you so badly." "What will you do now?" James asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I start classes next month," Bradley replied. and I'm volunteering full-time at the youth center until then. The kids, they're helping me design a program to teach other officers what I've learned." As he spoke those words, a group of customers entered the store, including Mrs. Thompson, who had witnessed everything that day 6 months ago. She stopped in surprise when she saw Bradley, but then she noticed something that made her smile, the way Sarah and James were looking at him not with anger or fear, but with something close to respect. In that moment, Mrs. Thompson understood she was witnessing something rare and valuable, the proof that people really can change. 1 year had passed since the incident at Martinez Boutique. The store had changed little. The same elegant displays, the same classical music, the same warm atmosphere. But on this particular morning, something different was happening. The usual racks of clothing had been moved aside to make room for rows of chairs, now filled with police officers in training. Sarah Martinez, now a freshman in college, stood at the front of the store beside her father and Kevin Bradley. At 18, she carried herself with even more confidence than before. The past year had transformed her from a victim of prejudice into a voice for change. "My story could have ended very differently," Sarah began, addressing the young officers. "It could have been just another viral video, another angry protest, another example of what's wrong with the system." She glanced at Bradley, who nodded encouragingly. Instead, it became something else, a lesson about change, about seeing people for who they really are. In the audience, Sergeant Chen watched with pride. The training program she had developed with the Martinez family and Bradley had become a model for other police departments across the country. Today's session was being recorded for use in police academies nationwide. "When Officer Bradley put handcuffs on me that day," Sarah continued, "he saw what his prejudices told him to see, a young black girl who couldn't possibly belong in a high-end store." She paused, looking at the officers' faces. "But let me tell you what he didn't see." James stepped forward, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. He didn't see a father who had worked his way up from nothing. He didn't see a daughter who spent her afternoons learning the family business. He didn't see the story behind the scene he walked into. Bradley moved to the front, his social work textbooks tucked under his arm. He now spent his days studying and working with youth, but these training sessions were still the most important part of his week. "I was that officer who thought he was just doing his job," he told the group. "I told myself I was being vigilant, protecting businesses, but I was really just acting on biases I didn't even know I had." He looked at the young faces before him. "You're starting your careers at a time when things can be different, when they must be different." From the back of the store, Michael and several other teenagers from the youth center watched. They had become regular participants in these training sessions, sharing their experiences with new officers. Michael was now preparing for college, wearing a Martinez Boutique shirt. James had offered part-time jobs to several of the youth center kids. "The change starts with seeing," Sarah explained. "Really seeing people, not just your assumptions about them. It starts with understanding that every person has a story, a family, a life that matters." She walked over to the spot where she had stood in handcuffs a year ago. "Right here, my father taught me something important. He showed me that responding to prejudice with more anger only continues the cycle. Instead, we chose to create something positive." The program they had built together, the Martinez Initiative, as it was now called, had already trained hundreds of officers. It combined classroom learning with real community interaction, pushing officers to confront their biases and connect with the people they served. "Today, when I walk into stores," Sarah said, "I still sometimes see security guards following me. I still notice people making assumptions. But I also see hope for change." She smiled at Bradley. "I see it in the way a former officer became one of our strongest advocates for reform. I see it in your faces today as you listen and learn." James stepped forward again. "This store has been in our family for over 20 years. It has seen many changes, but none more important than this. Today, it's not just a boutique, it's a classroom for change." As the session ended and the officers began to talk with the youth center teenagers, Sarah watched from behind the counter. Her canvas bag, the same one that had started everything, now held college textbooks instead of inventory lists. But she still helped at the store whenever she could, proud of what her family had built and what they were continuing to build. Bradley joined her, holding up his phone. "Just got the news," he said, smiling. 3 more cities want to adopt the program. Your story is making a real difference, Sarah." She looked around the store, at her father deep in conversation with some officers, at Michael helping a customer, at the youth and police talking together like people, not stereotypes. "No," she said softly. "Our story is making a difference. All of us together." Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, but inside Martinez's boutique, something extraordinary had grown from a moment of injustice, a blueprint for real change, one person, one conversation at a time.